My name is Peter Piot, and I'm the director of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And it's my pleasure to introduce the speakers for this plenary session with keynote lectures. And the first speaker basically doesn't need any introduction. And I think it's not an exaggeration to say that very few people have done more to put health on the wider agenda than Laurie Garrett. Laurie is a senior fellow of the Global Health Program at the Council for Foreign Relations, which is one of the most influential, if not the most influential think tank in the world. And she has a unique combination of solid knowledge of science and health issues, superb writing and communication skills, and unparalleled political insight. And these are the three elements that make or break, I think, progress in health, as in so many other issues. Just one more thing, and that is that we all know The Coming Plague, we all know Betrayal of Trust, two bestsellers, but also I would encourage everybody to read I Heard the Sirens Scream. And this is, among all the books about September 11, this is the one that is different. And it is how Americans, not America, but Americans, people, responded to September 11 and the anthrax attacks in the US. And Laura has many awards, including the Pulitzer Prize. So, Laura, please.
As long as we're plugging books, Peter, there's no time to lose. And if you haven't read Peter's book, go grab it, one means or another, because it's a thriller and it's a page turner, and at the same time you're going to learn more about what's wrong with the UN than you ever thought you'd know. As people are coming in, I have to apologize to everybody. This is a very, very PowerPoint-driven talk. You're going to have about 390 slides going by at lightning speed. Those of you who come late will be lost. You'll have no idea what's going on. If you're not seated where you can see, I suggest that you move up, and let's just get rocking and rolling, because what we're talking about is a transformation that's created great disappointment in the entire global health atmosphere, development, climate change work across the board. We have to go back to the beginning and recall the early days to understand why we are at the terrible point we're at now. In the early days, when we talked about global health, we were talking about one institution, the World Health Organization, which was born in 1948 into a deeply bifurcated world, a Cold War world in which one part of the world was aligned with communism, one with capitalism, and a whole lot of the poor world was being played between the two big players. And WHO had to straddle this very difficult political divide. It straddled it for everything from trying to deal with smallpox eradication, the Alma-Ata agreements, immunization programs, lying, distorted vital statistics created by governments knowing they were lies, and still WHO had to use them, and personnel issues. It was a bifurcated world that is symbolized by the city that we're sitting in which the Berlin Wall, as you can see from this satellite imagery, divided the German people. In fact, you're seated right here on one side of that wall. And we're almost at the anniversary of the teardown of that wall, November 9th, 1989, the turning point for our world as we know it, really the dawn of globalization along with the end of communist rule. And it was a time here in Berlin when the entire world was riveted on the young people of this city and the courage they were showing on both sides of the wall to say, enough already of this bifurcation, enough already of this Cold War. It's time to build policies for all the people of all the world that do not simply reflect the power struggle between the two. Now, we thought we were going to get this thing called a peace dividend. Suddenly, if there was no Cold War, couldn't we have tons of money for things like global health? But it was squandered by the two Bushes, turned into warfare expenditure. So where were we by 1990? All of what we call global health was a $5.6 billion budget. And though we call it global health, let's be real, it was an international public health program focused on vaccination, safe drinking water, pest control, vector control, all the standard things from the toolkit of public health. Missing in it was any significant contribution for the largest pandemic of our time, HIV/AIDS, a total budget of only $300 million in 1990. So the first global challenge that we faced was negligence, trying to get the world to take this huge pandemic seriously, a pandemic that still is the great pandemic of our time and still gets taken casually, almost as an aside. So our first challenge is getting people to care. And it starts with the institution that was at charge at the time, WHO, which by far had the largest budget, by far had the most power and control in 1990. USA, France, and NGOs trailed far behind in terms of the size of their influence, their budget, and their power in 1990 in the world of global health. And so it's quite significant that WHO made a distinct decision. They ignored the pandemic in the early 80s. They allowed the creation of a global program on AIDS in late 80s, and then they destroyed it. And so the lead institution, the El Jefe, the one in charge, said, screw this pandemic. And out of it, we got UNAIDS. Thankfully, Peter Piot was put in charge so that we actually had a viable program in a very strange method of operation involving multiple UN agencies trying to have coherence. But governments remained in denial all across the world, acting as if this really wasn't a terribly important pandemic. It really didn't matter very much. And by 2001, you had a kind of pleading going on, a global activism created around a single public health issue. And there was hope that it could be achieved, that real money would happen. But then 9/11 happened. And with 9/11, the pre-9/11 al-Qaeda actions in Kenya and Tanzania, and the post-9/11 actions carried out by al-Qaeda in London, Madrid, Mumbai, and so on, we saw another kind of bifurcation created in our world. We'd gotten rid of the Cold War only to replace it with a war against terrorism. And it is a war against terrorism that has, in many ways, paralyzed and stymied much of what we would like to see as the positive aspects of globalization, a real kind of sharing across the world of the public goods of the planet. So what did this mean for global health? Surprisingly, it did not mean that global health funding disappeared. On the contrary, we have had remarkable post-2011 growth. But it has been marked by sloppiness. It has been haphazard and urgent, and therefore hasn't had the kind of decent planning necessary. It has involved so many donors with so much complexity that recipients on the ground have no idea where their money is coming from. It is heavily biased towards the medical treatment of HIV. It has been immediately imperiled by the world 2008 financial crisis and ongoing global recession. It has been challenged by the massive world inflation in food pricing and the multitude of other problems that are distracting our world leadership at this time, keeping them from focusing on specifics. And finally, I will tell you that it is all challenged by events transpiring this day in the United States of America. So let's look at the good side, the explosion. You know, suddenly global health, believe it or not, was chic. And there you were at Davos, and there was Bono saying, woohoo! And you had all over in the sort of elite of the world, the Aspens, the TED conferences, and so on, a surge in interest and in money. And that led to this tremendous donor complexity, so that we've gone from one player on the field, UNAIDS, with finally WHO coming back to some limited degree, and boom, an absolute explosion in multilaterals and bilaterals. Even institutions that were quite old but hadn't focused on health before suddenly were moved into the global health sector. And indeed, if you were on the recipient end of this in a country like Lesotho or Malawi, you couldn't keep track. Who the heck are these people traipsing through my office every day? And this is only the sort of public sector of it. If you go to the private sector and ask, what about the NGOs? Well, 60,000 were born in 8 years just for HIV alone. And if you add in maternal health and every other cause, suddenly the silos became rather large. And the complexity of it for both sides, in terms of accountability and knowing who you're dealing with at the receiving end, became overwhelming, just the paperwork alone. Then you had this massive new player on the private sector side, and unparalleled. There has never been anything close to what the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation represents in terms of the amount of money that they have poured into global health. And global health has been the lion's share of all the Gates Foundation efforts by far. In fact, in their latest funding cycle, they've increased the share of donation that is targeting global health. And the Gates Foundation has consistently not only played an enormous role in terms of affecting the money picture, but also the policy picture. So that today, though it is not accountable and has no board of directors to answer to, the Gates Foundation is the single most influential force from the private sector side on global health, bar none. No other institution comes close. Well, despite all this money, in terms of HIV, the best we can say is we reached a plateau. But we still have an absolutely intolerable number of new infections, intolerable number of deaths, and thanks to treatment, a ever-mounting size of infected population. The primary focus of this huge surge in money has been HIV, and that has indeed been focused on getting antiretroviral treatment to those in need in poorer countries around the world. It was initially thought to be a simple thing, just hand out pills, and of course everybody discovered it was highly complex. And the complexity began with the lack of absorption capacity at the receiving end. Institutions capable of taking in what had been hundreds of $1,000 budgets had to take in hundreds of $1,000,000 budgets. And indeed, by May 2012, our PEPFAR organization in the United States admitted that about $1.5 billion had gone unspent simply because there was lack of absorption capacity in the receiving countries. We had no gold standard. What is it we're supposed to do with all this money? What is the target to achieve? What is the gold standard of care? We didn't have one. But increasingly, those involved in the HIV effort found themselves getting into primary care. And once they got into primary care, they stepped into territory where outside donor-supported programs had never been before, and that's long-term management of chronic disease. Nobody had ever done this. And we found ourselves wandering into this foreign terrain, and that hit problem number 3, because we transformed without thinking about it. After so many years of ignoring the HIV pandemic, treating it as if it were almost a side event, suddenly the global health community embraced it, but without it really thinking, what does that mean we're doing as global health? So we transformed overnight, without any real collective conversation, from being a global public health effort to being a medical healthcare delivery effort. Poof, just like that. We changed the whole nature of the mission, of who we were employing, of how money was flowing, and the first thing we discovered was, oh my goodness, there aren't healthcare workers, and oh gee whiz, there's no health infrastructure on the ground. And that led to a sudden appraisal. What can we do? How can we not have this surge of attention to the treatment of HIV disease distort very, very weak, fragile systems on the ground? Well, these old numbers that you're all familiar with from Tim Evans and Lincoln Chen are actually certainly far worse today. But we've skewed very limited supplies of healthcare workers all over the world towards cities, and more importantly, towards North America. And we have a deficit of well over 4 million doctors and nurses, pharmacists, dentists, and lab technicians, and that deficit is most acute for the continent of Africa, where it is a quarter of the entire deficit. So we have no exit strategy, no gold standards of what we're trying to achieve, a paucity of healthcare workers, very weak infrastructures. Oh, well, let's just surge forward because certainly we can always politically pressure the donors, right? We'll just keep the money flowing, we'll have endless billions, and somewhere along the way we'll figure out what the hell we're doing. And we'll have some kind of a target. Oops, 2008, along comes the world financial crisis. Uh-oh, what is this going to mean for this generous growth that we have seen, staggering, in global health overall and in particular for HIV funding? What will this world financial crisis mean for this venture that we have built? We didn't feel it right away, even though the crisis was precipitous and immediate because of the lag time in funding cycles. But by 2010, all over the world, global health programs were feeling the pain. Remarkably, one did not, Gavi, the Global Alliance of Vaccine Initiatives, and that was because of David Cameron and the UK, despite its own high unemployment, committing to a tremendous increase in support for Gavi. But this has meant a focusing of the UK's entire effort, much less going elsewhere. Across the Eurozone, we are seeing the dominoes fall and a loss of key donor nations. In some cases, 100% loss. In some cases, dramatic reductions in what donors are willing to give for, to, and the actual quantity. And the Eurozone is experiencing its own health crises as a result, with 20% more deaths overall in Portugal, with a huge increase in HIV and in suicides in Greece. So from the Eurozone, we have seen a steady decline in support for what we call global health and HIV support. And we can predict that this is only going to get worse, because it's not an overnight achievement for the Eurozone to settle its own affairs. And it is understandable that the average European is more concerned about what's happening on this continent at the moment than what's happening outside. Well, the G8's meeting, Obama's leading, so maybe they'll come to the rescue, right? Oops, wait a minute, Putin says, screw you, I'm not coming, G7. Okay, maybe the G7 will come up with solutions. Well, they dither and dither, and of course, as we've all learned, the G7 is no longer really leadership. In fact, the G20 is leadership. So less than a year ago, the G20 met, and this is who the G20 was. Since then, the G20 has already seen the most dramatic leadership shift in world history. In other words, we're losing all the most powerful leaders, boom, 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 in a single year's time. Some are out completely. Some are facing giant struggles politically in their countries, and may be out by the time I give this talk, in 3 weeks in West Virginia. The turnover is unprecedented, according to The Economist, and certainly is on a scale that, as I say, has not been seen in key power centers. So 3 countries play the key role now in the world: India, China, and Brazil. And in the case of China, we know a massive power struggle is underway right this moment within the Communist Party. We cannot predict where this is headed. You cannot say with any certitude what China will be as a global player a year from now. Now, a lot of the Nobel Prize is an evil thing to receive. Obama did not benefit from receiving it, and indeed, his job approval rating has plummeted. We're in an election, and at this moment, you cannot call it. It literally, in polls today, 47% versus 47%. So, poor Euro, you got the Nobel Prize. I hope you don't experience the same downside as Obama as a result. If you ask Americans right now, what is their number one concern? Amazingly, it is, regardless of their political affiliation, the widening wealth gap within the United States, as more and more of the wealth concentrates into the top 0.1%, fewer than 20,000 families. A UNICEF survey not yet published shows that among its employees, the wealth gap around the world is perceived as the number one challenge to global health and public health programs, in particular because as the wealthy get more of the money, they become less interested in public goods funding. Offshore wealth has increased dramatically, according to the very conservative McKinsey Corporation. More than 30% of the wealth of the planet is not in circulation now, therefore not contributing to job creation and public goods, because less than 100,000 families control it, and it's offshored, hidden from taxation. So that means we have a third less capital to work with. Now, you would like for leaders to address this, to challenge those that would hoard the wealth that might transform our world, but they're overwhelmed. So many crises are slamming them right and left: earthquakes and warfare, giant flood events, giant hurricane events, cyclones right now threatening Philippines, Arab Spring, the deposition of Gaddafi, the ongoing struggles in the Eurozone. If you add it all up, it's just an absolutely overwhelming amount on the plates of the leadership of the world. And of course, when you talk about missing capital and human life, you have to think of the cost to the NATO nations, and in particular the United States, Afghanistan and Iraq, of these 2 terrible wars. Again, those are lives not on the field and money not in play for use for positive. Barely had the world financial crisis hit than we realized we were in a world food crisis. And we saw overnight spectacular inflation in rice prices, prompting riots in much of Asia, corn prices, wheat, and soy. And the paradox is that we were descending into recession, but we started then and have continued to have inflation in food. So that food pricing is rising even as the rest of the world and paycheck size in most of the world is deflating. The immediate inflation in 2008, according to the World Bank, put 100 million people backwards into subsistence poverty overnight. If that's not a global health issue, then I don't know what you guys are talking about. Subsistence equals malnutrition equals poor health equals go down the list. Where are we today? Well, if you look at the inflation in food prices in the United States and around the world, it's spectacular. Wheat and rice in particular. In Sudan, you see huge inflation this year. India, South Africa, Bangladesh. For rice, Malawi is hardest hit right now. Rwanda, India, and Mozambique coming in behind. What this means is in any given country, you have 14 to 90% greater cost for basic foods. The most striking trend is in China, where there's nothing but up. Food prices can only get worse. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization, we see a steady roller coaster, but upward bound. And the question is the trajectory. Is it upward bound compared to 1990s, or are we in a unique inflationary spiral that is post-2000, 21st century? Well, there are a lot of things driving this. There's more humans that are hungry, more humans that want to eat. But also more and more of the humanity is entering the middle class, which is a good thing, except that means that they want to eat more, and in particular, they're changing what they want to eat. One of the first signals of entering the middle class is the demand to eat meat. And as consumption of meat skyrockets, directly correlating with GNI, you see greater and greater pressure on resources, on water, on the basic grains used to feed meat. This is not sustainable over time. And I'm not talking about a lot of time. I'm talking about maybe 20 years. We cannot keep growing the middle class with the growing expectation of meat consumption and imagine pricing will be affordable and resources of water support that level of consumption. And so we are in a definite food crisis that is not temporary, but rather perhaps our new norm, our new state of being. One of the other contributors to this is this tremendous inequity in production. North America by far produces the majority of the world's food supply, with Russia with wheat coming in second. And as climate change puts more and more pressure, as we've seen this year with the drought in North America bringing corn prices to record highs, Oxfam predicts that Africa will bear the brunt of climate-induced shifts in the availability of food supplies, so that we will only see the crisis worsen, particularly in the poorest parts of the world. Which takes us to the next problem, climate. All right, skeptics. The lead skeptic, the Koch brothers, some of you have heard of them. They're financing the Romney campaign. They financed a skeptic named Richard Muller to go over 1.6 billion climate records starting from the mid-18th century to prove that there was no climate change. He found the opposite. He found a dramatic trend leading to surface temperature rise, storm anomalies, weather anomalies, all truly skyrocketing after 1980. So that you have one level trend increase before and a whole other experience after. And they create a composite of the now converted to the climate change away from skepticism that demonstrates this. So if you start in 1753, you see that you're having temperature anomalies in the countries undergoing industrial revolution, particularly Northern Europe and the east coast of the Americas. And the anomalous situation is not really seen elsewhere in the world until colonialist expansion takes the beginnings of industrialization to India. And so you will begin to see in parts of the southern hemisphere the first triggers of industrialization prompting these vast temperature anomalies. Most of the anomalous temperatures have more to do with winter due to pollution blocking appropriate protection of the planet. And it's not till later in the 19th century you begin to get anomalies in the summer. And they begin to extend into Latin America, and then with colonization of Australia and New Zealand, you'll see the first anomalous events become permanent in the southern hemisphere. Now we're seeing Russia and most of Asia taking on anomaly, and the beginnings of Latin America by the late 1800s. Again, very few of these have become permanent features, rather seasonal cycles, except in Northern Europe and the eastern part of the United States, where it all began. Still, Antarctica is spared, and the deep southern hemisphere is having only mild events with the exception of Australia and New Zealand. And it's not until you begin to go into the 20th century that the whole world starts to be involved, and you see the very beginnings of abnormality in Antarctica appearing. Still, again, we're heavily concentrated in the Arctic and in the far northern hemisphere as we go towards World War II and the vast industrial expansion spawned by the military efforts and conflict in World War II, particularly in North America and Europe. Coming out of World War II and the expansion of industrialization to be a reality all over the world, you see that the least anomalous areas are coincident with the poorest parts of the planet, and the most anomalous are in the wealth. But look at what's happening in Antarctica. We now have permanent transformation. We're getting melt. We're starting to lose both polar ice caps by the 1980s. They are beginning to melt, and the seas are beginning to rise. And now, as we enter towards the 21st century, you will see this surge very dramatically, so that now we go to a new norm, which is a new, much hotter world, a truly transformed world, and one in which Antarctica and the Arctic are shedding their mass at a steady pace. This is the world that we are part of as we talk about global health. If we ignore this, we ignore the real reality. This year we had the largest ice melt of the Arctic in world history, and we were down to only 75% of the ice, 75% of the ice lost, a 50% increase in 10 years' time. The ice is in fact disappearing far faster than the United Nations IPCC had predicted, and that even exceeds the melt rate of the most radical predictions made by any of the climate change advocacy community. You can see that there's been a sudden and precipitous change in the pace. And this is really that we've eliminated the albedo effect. So as you decrease the amount of ice surface, less is being reflected back to the sun. This turns out to have a far more dramatic and rapid pace of impact than we had thought. And it certainly is impacting human disease already. These are not these many charts you will see very quickly saying, you know, we in Europe predict these will be the diseases in the future with climate change, or we in North America predict in the future. These are no longer in the future, they are now. The climate change impact on disease, on the environment of insects in particular, on the bird carrier environments, has transformed completely. We are already seeing that cholera and other dysentery diseases are less likely to be focused on only July and August in the Northern Hemisphere, and we're expanding the dysentery season so that it's now starting out in May and not ending until October. Soon we could see parts of the Northern Hemisphere experience permanent 12-month dysentery and cholera cycles. Malaria is appearing in places that had not had significant malaria problems before because the mosquitoes are appearing in places they'd not been before. And they're appearing not just in countries, but in higher altitudes where they'd not been before, so that all of East Africa is experiencing ever higher altitude malaria. This is not a projection, this is a reality, it is now. So if you're part of the malaria fight, your territory is expanding faster than you're getting the bed nets out the door. And that's just the reality, and it's thank you, climate change. As you look around the world, you can pick out some of the already expanded zones for malaria, dengue, and other West Nile virus, other mosquito-borne diseases. And we can already see an impact in terms of dengue hemorrhagic fever. So that there's actually a correlation between Celsius single degree increase as mean temperature in a zone and the presence of dengue carrying mosquitoes captured on site. So we have a 1-to-1 or worse than 1-to-1, but a direct correlation. This year, for the first time, malaria carrying birds have been found in Alaska. As far as we know, that's never occurred in the history of the planet before. We can expect that the malaria zone will expand across Siberia, and we will indeed have Arctic malaria very shortly. Whether it'll have human health impact beyond the bird populations remains to be seen. The key thing we do know that we need to brace for, that we're not prepared for, is what heat means to elderly populations. Harvard just published a study looking at, over records from 1985 to 2006, for every 1 degree Celsius increase in summer temperatures, they saw dramatic increases in death rates for elderly populations with underlying chronic disease problems. A 4% increase for those with diabetes, 3.7 for those with chronic lung disease, 2.8 with underlying cardiovascular disorders. Overall, 10,000 additional deaths for every 1 degree centigrade increase. And this is just in the United States. If you imagine this as a global phenomenon, the numbers become enormous. And of course, you need to imagine it right here in Europe because you have experienced a very sharp increase in surface temperatures. And of course, 2003 taught Europe the lesson when the folks in Paris, as they always do, abandoned the city in August, left behind a lot of senior citizens that were untended to, and had a record number of deaths as a result. Really a national shame, with more than 11,000 perishing in the heat wave in Paris as the rest of their families were away on vacations. This led to some serious soul searching for the French, but it should also lead for soul searching for everybody that thinks that they're part of global health, because this is the new norm. It may vary from one summer to another, but the trend is there. What sorts of health systems are prepared to deal with this level of increase of need for heat stroke attention and for response to temperature? I'm going to have to rush forward because I'm getting the signal that I'm running out of time already, and I had not been told that my time was this limited. So let me just get out of the climate issue quickly, other than that it will overwhelm all our healthcare systems. And that we do have one source to pay attention to. During the Olympics, when all the factories were shut down in China to give them clean air, we actually could measure the differential pre- and post-Olympic and saw that Chinese air was affecting both overall CO2 planetary and air pollution indexes in cities all over the world. So we are all breathing the industrial expansion of China. And it is an industrial expansion that far exceeds Chinese own estimates. They have indeed been cooking the books. A recently published study shows a 10 gigaton deficit in China's reporting on its actual CO2 contributions, which makes it not only the biggest contributor, but by far the biggest contributor to what we're experiencing as a climate change phenomenon. So I want to close quickly and take us through why I think what's going on in the United States is going to imperil this entire mission. Though our global health is a tiny, tiny piece of our total federal budget, it's unprotected. And we have created a state of dependency where the United States is responsible for 58% of what we call HIV support as global health, and 52% of global health overall. And this skewing's actually gotten worse as more and more of the Eurozone has ceased being donors. This means we've created dependency of the entire mission we call global health on one source, the United States of America, and 68% of all private giving from one source, Bill and Melinda Gates. So if Bill wakes up tomorrow and decides he's more interested in something else, or if the U.S. government changes, oops, okay, so here it comes, everybody. The two Washingtons are calling the shots right now, Seattle and Washington, D.C. Whether you like it or not, they are where the money is. And this means that for WHO, the role has diminished tremendously. And indeed, you know, with a $1 billion shortfall, with 20% layoffs, and with a long-term budget that's less than the budget just for Gavi, WHO's importance in the world has greatly diminished from what I showed you in 1990 to a new WHO that is now being overtaken by the Global Fund, by NGOs, by Bill and Melinda Gates, and indeed now the Gates Foundation has overtaken WHO. These are the trends I would predict. I see a very dramatic reduction in U.S. support. The Global Fund already has reduced. I think WHO is going to have its budget shrink even further. The Gates Foundation will increase. Gavi will be the big beneficiary. But overall, I think we're looking at shrinking resources, and they're going to be shrinking for some time. And we are realigning the entire landscape of global health based on money, not based on what's needed on the ground, not based on policy, not based on what will save the most lives. It's about money. That's the metric. That's the driving it. And WHO is lost in the crowd. Indeed, its budget today is the same as it was in 1990. So, what does this mean? Too much dependency? Dependent on the United States in particular. If the U.S. budget cuts its funding, 7 million lives could be imperiled. In fact, AmFAR has published, and I urge you to look at it, an analysis of what will happen if we go into sequestration. I know you've never heard of it, but this is probably going to happen. This is mandatory budget action. Congress will say simply, we're cutting $1.2 trillion out of the budget, and that includes 8.5% of all global health money. Boom, gone, no questions asked, and it happens on March 1st. If you're not ready for this, if you haven't faced what's going on in the United States, if you don't know what's at stake in this election, you better brace yourself, because we've created so much dependency as a global health community on the United States as the primary donor that when this happens, you're looking at 276,000 people immediately off HIV treatment. You're looking at 6,000 deaths immediately for lack of access to malaria care. You're looking at immediate increase in deaths in tuberculosis. These are not future forecasts, people. This is the reality that we are facing right now in this mission that we call the global health against the fiscal cliff. And if we go into the total fiscal cliff, if this Congress continues to be the idiots that they have been, we will go back into a mega recession globally, and it will be an immediate effect. And it's not me saying this, it's Goldman Sachs, it's Barclays, it's HSBC, it's the biggest banks in the world telling us that we're facing disaster. So finally, what is to be done? We have to define our mission better. We have to be clear about what we're trying to accomplish. Our metrics cannot be about money, they have to be about human lives saved. I don't want to hear any more groups arguing who has more money. We have to stop dreaming that the super rich that have taken $32 trillion out of world circulation are going to suddenly wake up one morning and say, I care about global health. We have to decide, is it initiatives or is it a big mission? Can we connect to the climate mission? Can we connect to the food mission? Can we connect to the larger changes in public goods and the transformations in people's lives that's going on right now? Or will we stay narrowly focused on, I'm a diabetes person, I'm an HIV person, I'm a polio person, and we're all going to fight among each other for money and not even think about the fact that people don't have food to eat, but we're giving them a shot, and their village is being flooded by climate change, but we're giving them a shot. And finally, as I rush through to try and get us to this, we have to think about, as we try to define what is global health, there's a lot of pressure to expand it, and some of you come from the NCD community in this room. We're expanding onto something that was weak and crazy to begin with, that was chaos to begin with. So we're expanding on chaos. And we're not going to get more resources for that expansion. Either the global health community starts to get serious about organizing itself, understanding its mission, being very clear about how to define what is global health, or it's going to topple under the pressure that it's going to be experiencing now on the fiscal front. And that's my main message. Thank you.